The scream cut through the desert air like a knife, and Daniel Rawlings dropped the rope he'd been coiling, his boots already kicking up dust as he ran toward the sound. 28 years of living rough on the frontier had taught him to respond first and question later, especially when that scream carried the unmistakable edge of terror rather than pain. He rounded the barn to find a woman backed against the weathered wood, a rattlesnake coiled 3 feet from her worn boots, its tail singing that deadly song every Westerner knew to fear. Daniel grabbed a nearby hoe and with practiced precision dispatched the snake in one clean motion. The woman's knees buckled and he caught her elbow, steadying her before she hit the ground. Her eyes, when they met his, were the color of honey in sunlight, wide with fading fear and something else he couldn't quite name. She was young, maybe 23 or so, with dark hair escaping from beneath a faded bonnet and dust coating what had probably once been a decent traveling dress. "Thank you," she managed, her voice rough as though she hadn't spoken in days. "I didn't see it until too late." "Snake like that won't give much warning," Daniel said, releasing her arm once he was sure she had her footing. "You lost. White River's about 5 miles south, though I can't imagine what brought you out here to the Double R Ranch on foot." The woman's face went red, a flush creeping up from her collar to her cheeks. She looked down at her scuffed boots, her fingers twisting in her skirt. "I was told there might be work here. The man at the mercantile in White River said the owner's wife sometimes needs help with the house or the cooking." Daniel studied her more carefully now. She was thin, too thin, and there were dark circles under those pretty eyes. Her dress had been mended more than once, the stitching careful but the fabric worn beyond salvation. "Mrs. Patterson does most of the house herself, but we could use someone in the kitchen. The ranch hands have been complaining about my cooking for 3 months now, ever since our last cook ran off to try his luck in the gold fields." Hope flared in her expression, transforming her tired face. "I can cook. My mother taught me before she passed. I can clean too and mend and tend a garden if you have one. Name's Daniel Rawlings. I'm the foreman here. What do I call you?" "Beatrice Thompson," she said, and offered her hand like a man would, which surprised him. Her grip was firm despite the tremor still running through her from the snake encounter. "Most folks call me B." Daniel shook her hand, noting the calluses on her palm. This was a woman who knew work, whatever her story was. "I'll need to talk to Mr. Patterson, but we got a small room off the kitchen that's been empty. You'd get meals and $1 a week to start, more if you prove your worth." "I'll prove it," B said with such fierce determination that Daniel believed her. Mr. Patterson, a grizzled cattle rancher who'd built the Double R from nothing over 30 years, took one look at Beatrice and agreed on the spot, though Daniel suspected it was more from desperation than charity. The ranch ran 15 hands during the busy season, all of them hungry as bears, and Daniel's attempts at cooking had resulted in more than one threat of mutiny. B started that very evening, and Daniel found himself making excuses to stay near the house rather than riding out to check the fence line like he'd planned. He told himself it was to make sure she knew where everything was, to answer questions about how many men she'd be feeding come morning, but truthfully, he was curious. There was something about the way she moved through the kitchen, touching things with careful reverence, that spoke of a deeper story. Dinner that night was simple fare, beans and cornbread and salt pork, but it was cooked properly for the first time in months. The ranch hands ate with grateful enthusiasm, and Daniel caught Bee's small smile of satisfaction as she cleared the plates. After the men had dispersed to the bunkhouse or their evening chores, Daniel found her washing dishes at the pump behind the kitchen, her sleeves rolled up to reveal slender forearms. They seem to like it, he said, leaning against the door frame. It's not hard to improve on burned beans, Bee replied, but there was no meanness in her tone, just stating fact. She set a plate in the drying rack and reached for another. Mr. Rawlings, I need to ask you something. Daniel's fine. Daniel. She said his name carefully, like she was testing how it felt in her mouth. The supplies in the pantry, they're not marked clearly. I managed tonight because I know what cornmeal and flour look like, but there are tins and jars and I need to know what they are. I can make labels, Daniel offered. My handwriting's not fancy, but it's readable. Bee's hands stilled in the wash water. She didn't look at him when she spoke, her voice barely above a whisper. That would be kind, but it wouldn't help me much. I can't read. The admission hung in the air between them, heavy with shame that Daniel didn't understand at first. Then it hit him, the way she'd asked directions to the ranch instead of reading the sign posted at the main road, the way she'd touched the tins in the pantry with such careful confusion. "Can you write your name?" he asked gently. She shook her head, still not meeting his eyes. "My father didn't believe in schooling for girls, said it made them uppity and useless for real work. Then he died when I was 12 and my mother and I barely scraped by. She got sick 2 years ago and the medical bills took everything. I've been working where I could since then, but most places want references or contracts, and I can't read them to know what I'm signing." Daniel moved to stand beside her at the pump, taking a dish from her hands and drying it with the towel hanging nearby. "What if I taught you?" Her head snapped up, those honey-colored eyes wide with surprise. "What?" "I could teach you to read. Every evening after dinner, we could spend an hour or so working on letters and words. I'm no school teacher, but I learned well enough, and I've got books in my room we could use." "Why would you do that?" Suspicion crept into her voice, and Daniel realized she was probably used to men offering things with strings attached. "Because everybody deserves to know how to read their own name," he said simply. "And because you just fed 15 hungry cowboys without complaint on your first day, which makes you either brave or crazy, and either way deserves some reward." A smile tugged at the corner of her mouth. "Maybe a bit of both. So you'll let me teach you." Bee looked at him for a long moment, searching his face for something. Whatever she found must have satisfied her because she nodded slowly. "Every evening after the dishes are done." "Every evening," Daniel confirmed. True to his word, that very night, after the last pot was scrubbed and put away, Daniel appeared in the kitchen doorway with a worn primer in his hands and a slate he'd borrowed from the ranch office. Bee had changed from her work dress into something slightly less worn, and she'd taken her hair down from its severe bun, letting it fall in dark waves around her shoulders. The sight of it made Daniel's breath catch, though he couldn't have said why. They sat at the long kitchen table, a single lamp casting warm light over the scarred wood. Daniel opened the primer to the first page, showing Bee the alphabet printed there in neat rows. "We'll start with the letters," he said. "Each one has a name and a sound. Once you know them, you can start putting them together into words." Bee leaned forward, her attention focused entirely on the page. Daniel pointed to the first letter. "This is A. It can sound like ah as in apple or I as in 8. He went through each letter slowly, watching as she mouthed the sounds, her brow furrowed in concentration. When they reached Z, he handed her the chalk. "Now you try writing them. Start with A." Her hand shook as she touched chalk to slate, the line wobbly and uncertain. The first attempt at a looked more like a crooked teepee, but she tried again and again, until it started to resemble the letter in the book. Sweat beaded on her forehead despite the cool evening air, and Daniel realized how much courage this took, to expose her ignorance to a virtual stranger. "You're doing fine," he said softly. Nobody writes perfect the first time. How long did it take you to learn? She asked, not looking up from her slate. I was 5 when I started, so I don't rightly remember. But you're smarter than a 5-year-old and you want it more. That counts for a lot. They worked until the lamp oil ran low and Bee's eyes were drooping with exhaustion. She'd made it through the whole alphabet, could name each letter even if her writing was still shaky. When Daniel finally closed the primer, she looked at him with such gratitude that it made his chest tight. "Thank you," she said. "I never thought anyone would bother." "I don't bother with much," Daniel replied, surprising himself with the honesty, "but this seems important." As he walked back to his small foreman's quarters behind the main barn, Daniel found himself thinking about the way Bee's face had lit up when she'd successfully written the letter B, how she'd laughed at herself when her S came out backwards. He'd been foreman of the double R for 5 years now, had worked ranches across Arizona territory since he was 16, and he'd never met a woman quite like Beatrice Thompson. The next 2 weeks fell into a comfortable rhythm. Bee rose before dawn to start breakfast, feeding the hands as they stumbled in from their bunks, hungry and still half asleep. Daniel found himself timing his mornings, so he'd be in the kitchen when she was pulling biscuits from the oven, just to see the flour dusting her cheeks and the satisfied smile she wore when a meal came out right. During the day, he managed the ranch's operations, overseeing fence repairs and cattle roundups, breaking horses and settling disputes between the hands, but his mind kept drifting to the evening lessons. Every night after dinner, they sat at that kitchen table, working through the primer. Bee was a quick study, soaking up knowledge like parched earth soaking up rain. Within a week, she could write the entire alphabet without looking at the book. Within 2 weeks, she was starting to sound out simple words, her finger tracing under each letter as she slowly built them into meaning. "See a T," she read one evening, her voice triumphant. "Cat, now this one," Daniel said, pointing to the next word, "dog, dog." She looked up at him, her eyes shining. "I'm reading." "You are," he confirmed, and the joy in her face made him want to keep teaching her forever, just to see that expression again and again. But it wasn't just the lessons that were building something between them. It was the way Bee would save him the best biscuit at breakfast, setting it aside before the hands could devour the whole batch. It was how Daniel started bringing her wildflowers he'd pass on his rides, simple desert blooms that she'd put in a jar on the kitchen windowsill. It was the conversations that stretched beyond the evening lessons, talk of their lives and dreams and the hard roads they'd both traveled. Daniel learned that Bee's father had been a farmer in Kansas, a hard man made harder by failed crops and mounting debts. That her mother had been gentle and kind, teaching Bee everything she knew about cooking and keeping a home, even as her own health failed. That Bee had watched her mother waste away, unable to afford a proper doctor, working herself to the bone to pay for medicines that did nothing in the end. "I promised her I'd make something of myself," Bee said one night, her fingers stained with chalk dust as she practiced writing sentences. "That I wouldn't just disappear like she did, forgotten and poor." But it's hard to make something of yourself when you can't even read a wanted poster or a shop sign. "You're making something of yourself right now," Daniel told her. "You've got steady work, you're learning to read, and the hands think you're the best cook this ranch has ever had." "I heard Tommy Briggs tell Mr. Patterson yesterday that he'd sign on for another year just for your apple pie." Bee laughed, the sound warm and genuine. "That pie was half burned on the bottom. They didn't care, neither did I." Daniel hesitated, then added, "You're something special, Bee. Don't let anyone tell you different." She looked at him then, really looked at him, and Daniel felt something shift in the air between them. He'd been aware of her as a woman from the start, would have to be blind not to notice her prettiness, but this was different. This was the recognition of something deeper, a connection that went beyond foreman and cook, beyond teacher and student. "You're not like other men I've known," Bea said softly. "You don't make me feel small." "Why would I do that? You're one of the strongest people I've met." "Strong," she repeated as if testing the word. "My father would have laughed at that. He said I was weak, useless without a man to take care of me." "Your father was wrong." Daniel reached across the table, covering her hand with his. Her skin was warm, the calluses on her palm matching his own. "You survived after your mother died, made your own way, and now you're here building a future. That's not weakness." Bea turned her hand over, lacing her fingers through his. They sat like that in the lamplight, connected by more than just touch, until the sound of footsteps on the porch outside made them pull apart. One of the hands needed something from the kitchen, and the moment passed, but Daniel carried the feel of her hand in his all the way back to his quarters. A month into Bea's employment, a stranger rode up to the Double R. He was well dressed for the territory, with a silver watch chain glinting at his vest, and boots polished to a shine that looked out of place against the dusty ranch yard. Daniel was working with a young colt in the corral when the man approached, his horse picking its way carefully around the mud puddles from the previous night's rain. "I'm looking for Beatrice Thompson," the stranger said without preamble. "I was told she's working here." Something in Daniel's gut tightened. "Who's asking?" Charles Morton, attorney at law out of Kansas City. The man produced a card from his pocket, holding it out. Daniel took it, noting the fancy lettering, though the name meant nothing to him. "I have business with Miss Thompson regarding a legal matter." "What kind of legal matter?" "That's between me and my client," Morton said, his tone cooling. "Is she here or not?" Daniel considered sending the man away, but it wasn't his place to make decisions for Bea. "Wait here. I'll fetch her." He found Bea in the kitchen, rolling out dough for the evening's pot pie. She looked up when he entered, her smile fading when she saw his expression. "What's wrong?" "There's a lawyer here to see you. Name of Charles Morton from Kansas City. He says he has business with you." The color drained from Bea's face. "A lawyer? I don't know any lawyers. I haven't done anything wrong, Daniel. I swear I haven't. I believe you." He moved to her side, his presence solid and reassuring. "But you should probably hear what he has to say. I'll come with you if you want." She nodded, wiping her flour-covered hands on her apron. Together they walked out to where Morton was waiting, still mounted on his horse as if he was too important to stand on the same ground as ranch folk. "Miss Thompson," Morton said, tipping his hat. "I've been searching for you for quite some time. Your father's brother, Samuel Thompson, passed away 3 months ago in Kansas City. He left his entire estate to you." Bea stared at him, uncomprehending. "My Uncle Samuel. I didn't even know he was still alive. My father never spoke of him." "They were estranged, as I understand it. But your uncle was a successful merchant, and when he died without children of his own, he left everything to his only niece. That's you, Miss Thompson. You've inherited his house, his business, and a substantial sum of money. You're a wealthy woman." The words hung in the air, impossible and strange. Daniel watched Bea struggle to process them, her hands twisting in her apron. Morton was still talking, something about papers to sign and arrangements to be made, but Daniel could see Bea wasn't hearing any of it. "She can't read," Daniel said abruptly, cutting Morton off mid-sentence. "So whatever papers you've got, you'll need to read them to her, slow and clear, and explain what they mean in plain language." Morton's eyebrows rose. "Can't read? Well, that complicates matters, but we can manage. The main document is a deed transfer for the house and a bank authorization for the funds. You'll need to sign them, Miss Thompson, and then you'll have full access to your inheritance." "How much money are we talking about?" Daniel asked when Bea remained silent. The estate is valued at approximately $12,000, including the property and business assets. Daniel felt his own shock mirror Bea's. $12,000 was a fortune, more money than most people in Arizona Territory would see in a lifetime. It was enough to change everything. "I need to think," Bea said, her voice faint. "This is too much. I don't understand." "Of course," Morton said, though he looked impatient. "I'm staying at the hotel in White River. When you're ready to proceed, come find me. But don't take too long, Miss Thompson. These matters are time-sensitive." He rode away, leaving Daniel and Bea standing in the yard. She turned to him, her eyes wide and lost. "What do I do?" "First you breathe," Daniel said. "Then we go inside and you tell me everything you know about this uncle of yours." They sat at the kitchen table, the dough forgotten on the counter. Bea spoke haltingly about her father's family, the little she knew. Samuel Thompson had left Kansas when Bea was just a baby, heading to Missouri to make his fortune. Her father had called him a traitor and a fool, had forbidden any mention of his name in the house. Bea had almost forgotten he existed. "What if it's not real?" she asked Daniel. "What if it's some kind of trick? We can check." "I'll ride into White River tomorrow and talk to the sheriff, send a telegram to Kansas City if we have to." But that man seemed legitimate, Bea. His card, his manner, the way he talked about legal matters. "I think this is real." $12,000, she whispered. "I could do anything. Go anywhere." The words hit Daniel like a punch to the gut, though he kept his face neutral. Of course she'd leave. Why would she stay here, cooking for ranch hands and living in a tiny room off the kitchen, when she could have a house and a business and a life of her own? "You could," he agreed, his voice carefully level. "You could go back east, hire tutors to finish your education, live like a proper lady." Bea looked at him, her expression unreadable. "Is that what you think I should do?" What he wanted to say was stay. Stay here with me. Keep learning to read at this kitchen table. Keep making the morning coffee just the way I like it. Keep looking at me the way you did when I held your hand. But he had no right to ask that, no claim on her beyond the temporary bond of teacher and student. "I think you should do whatever makes you happy," he said instead. She studied his face for a long moment, then stood abruptly. "I need to finish the pot pie. The hands will be hungry come dinner time." Daniel watched her return to her dough, rolling it out with fierce concentration. He wanted to go to her, to pull her into his arms and tell her all the things building in his chest, but fear held him back. Fear that she'd reject him, that she'd see him as just another man trying to control her choices, that the growing feelings between them were one-sided, and he'd been fooling himself all along. Instead, he left the kitchen and threw himself into work, riding out to check the north pasture fence line even though it didn't need checking, just to put distance between himself and the impossible situation unfolding back at the ranch house. That evening's lesson was strained. Bea seemed distracted, making mistakes she'd mastered weeks ago, her attention drifting to the window and the darkness beyond. Daniel tried to focus on the primer, on teaching her the new words they'd planned to cover, but his heart wasn't in it either. "I talked to Mr. Patterson," Bea said suddenly, interrupting his explanation of silent ease. "I gave him notice. 2 weeks, so he has time to find another cook." The words landed like stones in Daniel's chest. "You're leaving. I have to see about this inheritance, don't I? I can't just ignore it." "No, you can't," Daniel agreed. "It's a chance most people never get." "Will you come with me?" The question burst out of her, raw and desperate. "To White River tomorrow to meet with Mr. Morton. I don't trust myself to understand everything he says, and I trust you." Relief flooded through Daniel, sweet and sharp. At least a little more time. "Of course I'll come." They rode to White River the next morning, Daniel on his steady roan gelding and Bee on the ranch's gentlest mare. It was a 2-hour journey across open desert, the November sun warm on their backs despite the season. They didn't talk much, but Daniel was acutely aware of her presence beside him, the way she sat her horse with growing confidence, the way the wind caught her hair where it escaped her bonnet. White River was a decent-sized town by Arizona Territory standards, with a main street of wooden buildings, a church, a school, and 2 saloons. The hotel where Morton was staying was the nicest building in town, 2 stories of whitewashed wood with actual glass windows. They found the lawyer in the hotel's small dining room, eating a late breakfast. He seemed pleased to see them, gesturing to the empty chairs at his table. "Miss Thompson, Mr. Rawlings, I'm glad you came. Shall we discuss the particulars?" For the next hour, Morton laid out the details of the inheritance. Samuel Thompson had owned a dry goods store in Kansas City that catered to wealthy clients, selling fine fabrics and imported goods. The business was currently being managed by his longtime partner, who wished to buy out Bee's share. The house was a 3-story Victorian in a respectable neighborhood. The bank account held just over $8,000 in cash after debts and final expenses were settled. Daniel asked questions when Bee seemed overwhelmed, clarifying terms and ensuring Morton explained everything in plain language. By the end, it was clear that the inheritance was legitimate and substantial, and that Bee had real decisions to make. "I'll need to go to Kansas City," Bee said slowly. "To see the house and the business, to sign the papers properly." "I can arrange transportation," Morton offered. "The train runs from Tucson to Kansas City, though you'd need to take a stage to Tucson first. Or, if you prefer, I can handle most matters by proxy, though that would require you to trust me with significant authority over your assets." "How long would I need to be in Kansas City?" Bee asked. "A month, perhaps 2, to settle everything properly." "You could return here if you wished, though I confess I don't understand why you would. Kansas City offers opportunities a woman of means might find appealing." Daniel watched Bee's face as she processed this. She looked small suddenly, despite her strength, overwhelmed by choices she'd never imagined having to make. "Can I have another day to think?" she asked. "This is all so much." Morton agreed, and they left him to his breakfast. Outside, in the bright Arizona sunshine, Bee turned to Daniel. "I need to see it. The house, the business, all of it. I need to know what my uncle built, why he left it to me." "That makes sense," Daniel said, though his heart was sinking. "Come with me." He stared at her. "What? To Kansas City? Come with me." She grabbed his hand, her grip tight and urgent. "I know it's a lot to ask, and you have responsibilities here, but I'm scared, Daniel. I'm scared of going alone, scared of making the wrong choices, scared of men like Morton who use words I don't understand to trick people like me. Please." Daniel should have said no. He was foreman of a working ranch, responsible for 15 men and hundreds of cattle. The busy season was just ending, but there was still winter prep to do, still 1,000 tasks that needed his oversight. Mr. Patterson depended on him. But Bee was looking at him with those honey-colored eyes, and he realized he'd follow her anywhere if she asked. "I'll talk to Mr. Patterson," he said. "See if he can spare me for a couple months." Bee threw her arms around him right there on the street, her bonnet falling back as she pressed her face to his shoulder. Daniel held her, breathing in the scent of her hair, flower and sunshine and something uniquely Bee. Over her head, he saw a few townspeople watching with interest, but he didn't care. Mr. Patterson, to Daniel's surprise, was understanding when they returned to the ranch and explained the situation. "Take the time you need," the old rancher said, studying them both with sharp eyes. Tommy Briggs can handle things for a while. He's been wanting more responsibility anyway. But Rawlings, you bring her back safe, you hear? And yourself too. I've had good foremen before, but none better than you." "Thank you, sir," Daniel said, moved by the unexpected sentiment. They spent the next week preparing for the journey. Bea worked with Mrs. Patterson to find and train a temporary cook, a widow from town who was grateful for the work. Daniel trained Tommy Briggs on the ranch's routines and quirks, made sure the ledgers were up to date, and arranged their travel to Kansas City. The evening lessons continued, but they took on a different tone. Daniel pushed Bea harder, knowing she'd need every skill she could master before facing the sophisticated world of Kansas City. She could read simple sentences now, could write her name with confidence, could puzzle through basic signs and labels. "You're going to be fine," he told her on their last evening at the ranch. "You're smart and you learn fast. Anyone who underestimates you is a fool." "I'm still scared," she admitted. "What if I get there and can't manage? What if I make mistakes and lose everything?" "Then you make mistakes and learn from them, same as anyone. But you won't lose everything, Bea. You've got your inheritance, yes, but you've also got skills and strength and determination. Those are worth more than money." She reached across the table, taking his hand. "And I'll have you." "You'll have me," he promised, and meant it with everything in him. They left for Tucson on a cold December morning, taking the stage with 3 other passengers: a drummer selling patent medicines, a minister heading to a new parish, and a young married couple traveling to California. The stage was cramped and uncomfortable, the road rough enough to rattle teeth, but Daniel didn't mind. Bea sat pressed against his side, her warmth seeping through his jacket, and every mile took them toward something he couldn't quite name but desperately wanted. In Tucson, they boarded the Southern Pacific Railroad, a marvel of modern engineering that still amazed Daniel even though he'd ridden it before. Bea had never been on a train, and her wonder at the steam engine and the passenger cars made him see the journey anew through her eyes. They had separate sleeping compartments, propriety demanding at least that much separation. But during the day they sat together in the passenger car, watching the landscape roll past. Daniel continued her lessons using a newspaper he'd bought in Tucson, teaching her to recognize common words and work through simple articles. Somewhere in Texas, as the winter sun set in a blaze of orange and pink, Bea fell asleep against his shoulder. Daniel sat very still, not wanting to wake her, acutely aware of every point where their bodies touched. He was in love with her. The realization came to him with perfect clarity. Not a sudden revelation, but the acknowledgement of something that had been growing since the day he'd killed that rattlesnake and caught her before she fell. He loved her determination, her courage, the way she'd faced her illiteracy with both shame and fierce resolve. He loved her laugh and her cooking, and the way she bit her lip when she was concentrating. He loved that she'd asked him to come with her, that she trusted him enough to lean on him both literally and figuratively. The question was what to do about it. Bea was about to become a woman of means, with opportunities and choices she'd never had before. What could he offer her? He was a ranch foreman with some savings and a horse, living in borrowed quarters on someone else's land. In the eyes of the world, he'd be marrying up, and people would say he was after her money. But maybe, if he was lucky, Bea wouldn't care what people said. Kansas City in December was a shock after the Arizona desert. Snow fell as their train pulled into the station, fat white flakes that turned the city into something from a storybook. Bea pressed her face to the window, her breath fogging the glass as she stared at the buildings rising 3 and 4 stories high, at the electric streetlights that were just starting to appear in the more modern areas, at the crowds of people bundled in winter coats and furs. "It's so big," she whispered. "It is," Daniel agreed, "but we'll manage. We've got the hotel address where Morton said he'd make us reservations, and tomorrow we'll see your uncle's house." The hotel was called the Riverside Inn, a respectable establishment near the business district. Morton had indeed reserved rooms for them, two small but clean spaces on the third floor. That evening, exhausted from travel, they ate dinner in the hotel dining room, looking overwhelmed by the menu until Daniel quietly read her the choices. "I can't believe people live like this every day," she said, watching a woman in a silk dress sweep past their table. "So much richness, so much plenty." "It's different from the territory," Daniel acknowledged. "But different doesn't mean better. These folks have their problems same as anyone." The next morning, bundled in coats they'd bought at a Kansas City mercantile, because their Arizona clothes were useless against the cold, they met Morton at the address he'd provided. Samuel Thompson's house stood on a tree-lined street, a beautiful Victorian painted sage green with white trim. It was 3 stories as promised, with a wraparound porch and stained glass windows flanking the front door. B stood on the sidewalk, staring up at it. "This is mine, according to the deed, yes," Morton said, producing a key. "Shall we go inside?" The house was fully furnished, every room decorated with the care of someone who'd had money and taste. There were Turkish rugs and velvet curtains, a formal dining room with a table that could seat 12, a library filled with books, bedrooms with carved mahogany furniture. In the study, they found a portrait of Samuel Thompson, a stern-looking man with Bee's eyes and her determined chin. "He looks like he was lonely," Bee said softly, studying the painting. "Rich but lonely." "The housekeeper said he rarely entertained," Morton confirmed. "He was devoted to his business, to building something lasting. She also said he regretted the estrangement from his brother, your father. Tried several times over the years to make contact, but the letters were returned unopened." Bee touched the painting's frame gently. "My father was a proud, stubborn man. I wish they'd reconciled before it was too late." They spent the morning exploring the house, opening wardrobes full of clothes, finding china in the cupboards and silver in drawers. In an upstairs bedroom, clearly meant for a woman though it had never been used, Bee discovered a cedar chest full of quilts and linens, all hand-stitched with exquisite care. "My grandmother made these," she breathed, running her hands over the intricate patterns. "My mother told me about them, said her mother-in-law was the finest quilter in Kansas. She must have sent them to Uncle Samuel." The weight of family history pressed down on the moment, the lives lived and lost, the connections severed and now impossibly restored through death and inheritance. Daniel stood back, letting Bee process it all, ready to offer support if she needed it, but knowing this was something she had to work through herself. After the house, Morton took them to see the dry goods store. It occupied a prime location on a busy commercial street, the windows displaying bolts of silk and fine wool, lace and ribbons and imported buttons. Inside, the store was beautifully organized, with attentive clerks serving well-dressed customers. Morton introduced them to Harrison Webb, Samuel Thompson's business partner, a dapper man in his 50s with silver hair and a calculating gaze. "Miss Thompson," Webb said, bowing over Bee's hand, "I'm so pleased to finally meet you. Your uncle spoke of you often, hoped someday to reconcile with your family." "Mr. Webb," Bee replied, her voice steady despite her obvious nerves. "Mr. Morton said you wished to buy my share of the business." "I do indeed. I've run this establishment alongside your uncle for 20 years, and I know every aspect of its operation. I'm prepared to offer you $4,000 for your half, which I believe is more than fair given current market values." Daniel saw Bee's eyes widen at the sum, but before she could speak, he cut in. "We'll need time to verify that evaluation. I'd like to see the business ledgers if you don't mind." Webb's expression cooled. "And you are Daniel Rawlings, Miss Thompson's friend and advisor. The ledgers, please." For a moment, Webb looked like he might refuse, but Morton intervened smoothly. "Of course, Mr. Rawlings. All documents should be transparent in such transactions. Mr. Webb, if you'd be so kind." They spent the afternoon in Webb's office, going through years of ledgers and invoices. Daniel had managed ranch finances long enough to understand profit margins and operating costs, and what he found made him frown. The business was doing well, very well, pulling in nearly $6,000 in profit each year. "Your half of those profits would be $3,000 a year," he told Bee quietly while Webb was out of the office. "If he's offering $4,000 as a buyout, he's cheating you. The business is worth at least $10,000, probably more, which makes your share worth $5,000 minimum." Bee bit her lip. "What should I do?" "Ask for $6,000. He'll try to negotiate down, but we'll hold firm at $5,500. That's fair for both of you." When Webb returned, Bee sat up straighter in her chair. Daniel had coached her on the words, and she delivered them with creditable confidence. "Mr. Webb, I appreciate your offer, but I must decline. The business is worth considerably more than your proposal suggests. I would be willing to sell my share for $6,000. Webb's face reddened. "That's outrageous. You know nothing about running a business, Miss Thompson. My offer is generous given your inexperience." "My inexperience doesn't change the value of the assets and yearly profits," Bee countered, and Daniel felt a surge of pride at her composure. "$6,000, or I'll retain my ownership and hire someone to manage my interests." They negotiated for another hour, Webb blustering and cajoling by turns, but Bee held firm with Daniel's quiet support. Finally, Webb agreed to $5,500, to be paid in a cashier's check drawn on a reputable Kansas City bank. Outside, in the winter twilight, Bee grabbed Daniel's arm, her face flushed with triumph. "I did it. I stood up to him and I won." "You did," Daniel agreed, grinning at her excitement. "You were magnificent." She threw her arms around him right there on the street, laughing with pure joy. "I couldn't have done it without you, Daniel. I was so scared, but you helped me see clearly." He held her close, not caring about the passers-by or propriety. "You would have figured it out. You're smarter than you know." "Maybe," she said, pulling back to look up at him. Snow was falling again, catching in her hair like tiny stars. "But I'm glad I didn't have to do it alone." Over the next few weeks, they settled Samuel Thompson's affairs. Bee signed papers transferring the business to Webb, received her cashier's check, and worked with Morton to establish bank accounts and investments. Daniel helped her read every document, explained every term, made sure she understood what she was agreeing to. In the evenings, they continued the reading lessons in Bee's hotel room, propriety maintained by leaving the door open. She was reading full paragraphs now, working her way through one of the books Daniel had brought from Samuel's library. Watching her confidence grow, seeing her light up when she successfully navigated a difficult word, filled Daniel with a satisfaction deeper than anything he'd felt in his work. But beneath the satisfaction lurked worry. Their time in Kansas City was drawing to a close. Soon they'd need to decide what came next. Bee owned a beautiful house here, had money in the bank, could hire tutors to finish her education and join Kansas City society if she chose. What reason did she have to return to Arizona territory, to a tiny room off a ranch kitchen, and a job cooking for cowboys? He was trying to figure out how to ask her plans when she brought it up herself. They were in the hotel's small parlor, sharing tea on a snowy afternoon in early January. Outside, the city bustled with people going about their business, but inside it was quiet and warm. "I need to make a decision about the house," Bee said, setting down her teacup. "Morton says I should either move in or sell it. Letting it sit empty isn't wise. What do you want to do?" Daniel asked carefully. "I don't know." She looked out the window at the snow-covered street. "This is a beautiful city and the house is more than I ever dreamed of having. But when I think about living here, about staying, I just feel empty." Hope flickered in Daniel's chest. "Empty how?" "Like I'd be living someone else's life. My uncle's life, maybe, or the life people think I should want now that I have money, but it doesn't feel like mine." She turned to look at him, her honey-colored eyes serious. "Arizona felt like mine. The ranch, the desert, the work. And you, Daniel. You feel like mine." The words hung between them, brave and vulnerable. Daniel set down his own teacup, his heart pounding. "Bee, I need to tell you something. I'm listening. I'm in love with you." The confession came out rough, unpracticed, but utterly sincere. "I have been for a while now, maybe since that first day with the rattlesnake. I know I'm just a ranch foreman with not much to offer, and you're a woman of means now who could have anyone, but I can't let you make this decision without knowing how I feel." Bee's eyes filled with tears, but she was smiling. "You think you're just a ranch foreman? Daniel, you're the man who taught me to read, who believed I could learn when I'd given up on myself. You're the man who came all the way to Kansas City, because I asked, who helped me navigate a world I didn't understand. You're honest and kind and strong, and I've been in love with you for weeks, but I was afraid to say anything because I thought maybe you were just being nice." Daniel laughed, the sound shaky with relief and joy. "Just being nice. Bee, I've been making excuses to be near you since the day we met. I time my mornings so I can see you taking biscuits out of the oven. I bring you flowers because I like seeing them on your windowsill. I'd teach you to read every evening for the rest of my life if it meant I got to sit across a table from you." She was crying now, tears streaming down her face. "Ask me," she whispered. "Ask me what you want to ask me." Daniel stood, pulling her to her feet, taking both her hands in his. "Beatrice Thompson, will you marry me? Not for your money, because I'll sign any paper you want saying I've got no claim on it, but because I love you and I want to spend my life with you, wherever that life takes us." "Yes," Bee said, laughing through her tears. "Yes, I'll marry you. And we'll go back to Arizona because that's where we both belong, and we'll build a life there together." He kissed her then, right there in the hotel parlor, a gentle kiss that tasted of tea and tears and promises. When they finally pulled apart, they were both grinning like fools. They were married 2 weeks later in a simple ceremony at a Kansas City church, with Morton and the hotel clerk as witnesses. Bee wore a dress from her uncle's house, a beautiful cream-colored silk that fit her perfectly, and Daniel wore the only suit he owned, brushed and pressed for the occasion. The minister pronounced them man and wife, and Daniel kissed his bride with a heart so full he thought it might burst. The morning after the wedding, as they lay together in Bee's hotel room made legal and proper by marriage vows, Daniel watched his wife sleep in the early dawn light. Her dark hair spread across the pillow, her face peaceful in sleep, and he marveled at the path that had brought them here. A rattlesnake and a job offer, reading lessons and an unexpected inheritance, all of it weaving together into something that felt like fate. Bee's eyes fluttered open and she smiled when she saw him watching her. "Good morning, husband." "Good morning, wife," he replied, still getting used to the words. They spent another week in Kansas City, finalizing arrangements. Bee decided to sell the house, reasoning that keeping property so far from where they'd live made little sense. The sale brought another $8,000, added to her already substantial inheritance. She kept some of her uncle's books, the quilts her grandmother had made, and the portrait of Samuel Thompson. "I want our children to know where they came from," she explained to Daniel as they packed. "The good and the bad, the estrangement and the reconciliation, all of it. It's part of who I am." "Our children," Daniel repeated, the phrase making him smile. "I like the sound of that." In late January, they boarded the train back to Arizona Territory, husband and wife now, with Bee's fortune safely transferred to a bank in Tucson and plans forming for their future. During the long journey, they talked about what they wanted to build together. "I want land," Daniel said. "A place of our own, not working for someone else. Enough acres to run cattle, maybe break horses, something we can pass down someday." "I want a school," Bee added. "Not a big one, just a small schoolhouse for ranch children and kids from the outlying areas who can't make it to town. I want to teach them to read, so no one has to feel the shame I felt not knowing." "We could do both," Daniel said. "Buy land, build a ranch house and a schoolhouse. You could teach while I manage the cattle and horses. We'd be partners in everything." Bee leaned her head on his shoulder, watching the landscape roll past. "Partners in everything," she agreed. "I like that very much." When they arrived back in White River, Mr. Patterson threw them a celebration dinner at the ranch. All the hands were there, along with Mrs. Patterson and several families from nearby spreads. They toasted the newlyweds and exclaimed over the story of Bee's inheritance and their Kansas City adventure. "So you're not coming back as foreman?" Mr. Patterson asked Daniel, though he didn't sound surprised. "No, sir. We're going to start our own place. But I'm grateful for everything you taught me and for giving Bee a chance when she needed it." "You were the best foreman I ever had," Patterson said, shaking Daniel's hand. "I hate to lose you, but I understand. A man needs to build something of his own. You find land you like, you let me know. I might be willing to sell you some of those acres bordering the north pasture. Good grazing there, and a creek that runs year-round." Daniel and Bee exchanged glances. They'd looked at several properties, but none had felt quite right. "We'd be interested in seeing those acres," Daniel said carefully. The next day, Patterson took them out to the land he'd mentioned. It was beautiful country, 500 acres of high desert grassland with the promised creek cutting through, mountains rising purple in the distance. There was a flat area perfect for building, with cottonwoods providing shade and shelter from the wind. "How much?" Daniel asked. Patterson named a figure that was fair, maybe even generous. "And I'll throw in 20 head of cattle to start your herd as a wedding present. You helped me build this ranch into what it is, Rawlings. It's only right I help you start yours." They bought the land that week, paying cash from Bee's inheritance. The deed was made out to both of them, husband and wife, equal partners as they'd promised. Then they hired workers and began to build. The ranch house rose slowly through the spring, a sturdy adobe structure with a wide porch and large windows to let in light. It wasn't fancy like Samuel Thompson's Kansas City Victorian, but it was solid and well made, designed for the harsh realities of Arizona Territory. They built a barn and a bunkhouse for future hired hands, corrals for horses and cattle, and a small building that would serve as Bee's schoolhouse. Daniel worked from dawn to dusk, his hands blistered and aching but his heart content. This was his land, his future taking shape in wood and stone and sweat. And every evening, no matter how tired he sat with Bee and continued her reading lessons. She was reading full books now, had worked her way through several of the novels they'd brought from Kansas City. Her writing was neat and clear, and she'd started keeping a journal, recording their days and her thoughts. Watching her fill pages with her own words, Daniel felt pride that surpassed anything he'd accomplished in building the ranch. In June, they held the first session at Bee's school. 5 children came that first day, ranging from 6 to 13, children of ranch families from the surrounding area who had no easy access to White River's school. Bee taught them with patience and joy, remembering what it had felt like to struggle with letters and sounds, using that empathy to help them learn. Daniel would ride in sometimes during the school day, just to watch her teach. She glowed when she was helping a child sound out a word, when she saw understanding dawn in young eyes. This was her calling, he realized, as much as ranching was his. Their first child was born the following spring, a squalling red-faced boy they named Samuel Daniel Rawlings. Bee recovered quickly from the birth, strong and resilient as she was in all things, and within weeks she was back to teaching with the baby sleeping in a cradle at the front of the schoolhouse. "He'll grow up with books and learning all around him," Bee said, nursing Samuel while Daniel looked on with wonder. "He'll never know what it's like to feel stupid because he can't read. He'll also know what it's like to have parents who love him," Daniel added, touching his son's tiny hand. "That's worth more than all the books in the world." The ranch prospered over the next few years. Daniel's skill with horses became known throughout the territory, and people came from as far as Tucson to buy his trained mounts. The cattle herd grew, and they hired 2 hands to help manage the increasing workload. Money from Bee's inheritance sat mostly untouched in the Tucson Bank, invested wisely and growing, a security for their future. Bee's school grew too. By its 3rd year, she had 12 regular students and had to hire an assistant teacher, a young woman from White River with proper schooling credentials. Together they taught reading, writing, arithmetic, and history, providing education to children who might otherwise have grown up illiterate like Bee had been. 2 years after Samuel was born, Bee gave birth to twins, a boy and a girl they named Thomas and Margaret. The house rang with children's laughter, with the chaos of a growing family. Daniel built additions to accommodate them all, a nursery and extra bedrooms, a larger kitchen where Bee still cooked meals that had the hands begging for invitations to the main house. On a warm evening in May, with the twins asleep and Samuel playing quietly on the porch, Daniel found Bee in what they called the study, a small room lined with bookshelves. She was reading, her feet tucked under her, completely absorbed in the story. He watched her for a moment, marveling as he often did at how far they'd both come. From that first day with the rattlesnake to this moment, from illiterate cook and ranch foreman to landowners and parents, partners in a life they'd built together. Bee looked up, smiling when she saw him. "Come sit with me." He settled beside her on the small sofa and she leaned into him, her head on his shoulder. "What are you reading?" "A book of poetry. Listen to this." She read aloud, her voice confident and clear, no trace of the hesitation that had marked her early attempts. The words washed over him, beautiful and complex, and when she finished, he kissed the top of her head. "You've come so far," he said softly. "I'm so proud of you." "We've come far," she corrected. "You taught me to read, but I taught you that taking chances on people is worthwhile." "We learned together." "I suppose we did." He was quiet for a moment, then said, "I got a letter from Mr. Patterson today. He's thinking of selling the R, retiring to stay with his daughter in California. He wanted to know if we'd be interested in buying it." Bee sat up, looking at him with surprise. "That's a lot of land. Could we manage it along with what we already have?" "It would mean hiring more hands, building out our operation significantly. But yes, I think we could manage it. The question is, do we want to? We're comfortable as we are." "We don't need more." "But you want it," Bee said, reading him as she always could. "I can see it in your eyes. You want to build something even bigger." "Only if you want it too. We're partners, remember? Equal say in everything." Bee considered, her gaze distant as she thought it through. "If we bought it, We'd need to hire teachers for the school so I could help manage the ranch side. The children are getting old enough that they'll need more of my attention too. But Daniel, if this is your dream, then it's my dream too. Let's do it. They bought the double R that summer, merging it with their existing spread to create one of the largest ranching operations in that part of Arizona territory. The work was enormous, the challenges constant, but they met them together, making decisions side by side, supporting each other through difficulties and celebrating successes as one. Years passed in the rhythm of ranch life. The children grew, all three of them learning to read almost before they could walk, surrounded by books and their mother's gentle teaching. Samuel became a skilled horseman like his father, while Thomas showed an interest in the business side of ranching. Margaret, fierce and independent, announced at age 10 that she wanted to be a teacher like her mother. "Then you'll be a teacher," Bea told her daughter. "You can be anything you set your mind to as long as you work hard and never give up." The school continued to thrive, now employing 3 teachers and serving nearly 30 children. Bea had achieved her dream of ensuring no child in their area had to grow up illiterate, and the pride she took in that accomplishment shone in her face every time she visited the schoolhouse. On their 10th wedding anniversary, Daniel took Bea on a trip back to Kansas City. They stayed in the same hotel where they'd been married, walked the streets where they'd negotiated her inheritance, and visited her uncle's grave for the first time. Bea placed flowers on the headstone, thanking Samuel Thompson silently for the gift that had changed her life. "You ever regret it?" Daniel asked as they stood in the cemetery. "Leaving the city, selling the house, choosing a hard life on an Arizona ranch instead of comfort here?" Bea looked at him with such love that it took his breath away, even after 10 years. "Not for a single moment. That life would have been comfortable, yes, but empty. What we have is real and full and ours. I wouldn't trade it for anything." They returned to Arizona with renewed appreciation for what they'd built. The ranch was home now, in a way nowhere else could ever be. The land, the work, the community they'd become part of, all of it woven together into a life that satisfied them both. As the years continued to pass, Daniel and Bea watched their children grow into adults. Samuel took over much of the day-to-day ranch management, allowing Daniel to slow down a bit, though he never fully retired. Thomas went east to study business and then returned to handle the ranch's finances and expansion plans. Margaret became a teacher at her mother's school, then eventually took it over, expanding it into a full grammar school that served the whole county. All 3 children married and had children of their own, filling the ranch with a new generation. Daniel and Bea became grandparents, then great-grandparents, the years adding lines to their faces and silver to their hair, but never dimming the love between them. They still read together every evening, even when their eyes grew weak, and Daniel's voice sometimes faltered over words he'd known his whole life. Bea would take over when he tired, her reading still clear and confident, a skill she'd worked so hard to master and never taken for granted. On a spring evening much like the one when Daniel had first taught Bea her letters, they sat on the porch of the ranch house they'd built together over 40 years before. Their great-grandson was playing in the yard, chasing chickens and laughing with pure childish joy. The sun was setting over the mountains, painting the sky in shades of gold and pink. "Read to me," Daniel said, and Bea picked up the book of poetry she'd been working through, the same book she'd been reading that night so long ago when he'd asked about buying the double R. She read in the fading light, her voice still beautiful, and Daniel closed his eyes, listening. He thought about the path his life had taken, the choices and chances that had led him to this moment. Killing a rattlesnake and offering a job to a desperate woman. Teaching her to read at a kitchen table. Falling in love. building a life and a family and a legacy that would outlast them both. When Bee finished reading, she set the book aside and took his hand, their fingers intertwining as naturally as breathing. "What are you thinking about?" she asked. "Everything," Daniel said, "and how lucky I am." "We're both lucky," Bee replied. "I was lost when I came to this territory, couldn't even read my own name, and you found me, taught me, loved me. You gave me everything. You gave me just as much. Purpose, family, a reason to build something lasting. We made each other's lives better." Bee leaned her head on his shoulder, and they sat in comfortable silence as the stars began to appear overhead. Inside the house, they could hear their family preparing dinner, multiple generations gathered under one roof, bound together by love and history and the legacy Daniel and Bee had created. "I'd do it all again," Bee said softly. "Every moment, every choice, every challenge. All of it led me here to you, to this life. I'd do it all again in a heartbeat." "So would I," Daniel agreed, kissing the top of her head just as he had so many times over the decades. "So would I, my love." As night fell over the Arizona desert, the ranch house glowed with lamplight and rang with the voices of family. The school Bee had founded stood ready for another generation of students. The cattle wore the Double R brand. The horses trained by Daniel's methods were known throughout the territory. And in the cemetery on the hill behind the house, plots were reserved for when Daniel and Beatrice Rawlings would finally rest. Their headstone already carved with their names and the dates of their births, waiting only for the final numbers to complete the story. But that ending was still years away. For now, they had grandchildren to spoil and great-grandchildren to teach. They had each other, their love as strong as it had been that first evening when a ranch foreman had offered to teach a woman who couldn't read, and she'd said yes to lessons that would change both their lives forever. The ranch would continue long after they were gone, passed down through the generations they'd started. The school would educate children for decades to come, ensuring that what Bee had suffered, growing up unable to read, would never happen to another child in their corner of Arizona territory. And the story of how they'd met, how they'd fallen in love, how they'd built an empire from nothing but determination and partnership, would be told and retold, becoming part of family legend. But the heart of it all, the core that everything else grew from, was simple. A man had seen a woman in need and offered help without expecting anything in return. She'd been brave enough to accept, vulnerable enough to trust, and strong enough to build a new life from the foundation he'd helped her create. They'd fallen in love not despite their differences, but because of them, each filling gaps in the other's life, until they became something greater together than they ever could have been apart. On that porch in the gathering darkness, with family all around and a lifetime of memories between them, Daniel and Bee sat hand in hand, content in the knowledge that they'd lived well, loved deeply, and left the world better than they'd found it. It was enough. It was everything. It was the kind of ending that felt like forever, because the love they'd built would echo through generations, immortal in the legacy they'd leave behind. And when the stars filled the sky overhead, brilliant and infinite in the clear desert air, they reflected in the eyes of two people who'd found each other against all odds and held on tight, weathering every storm, celebrating every joy, partners until the end and beyond. This was their story. This was their life. And it was, in every way that mattered, exactly as it was meant to be.